In the annals of history, there are rare moments when an individual's survival defies all rational explanation, challenging the very bedrock of scientific and logical understanding. It is a time when eyewitnesses attest under oath to an impossible reality, leaving chroniclers and analysts bewildered by the sheer inexplicability of the event. Such a moment occurred in 1847, deep within the remote, sweltering landscape of a Georgia plantation, the domain of a wealthy and tyrannical landowner named Baron Wilhelm Vanir. Vanir, a man whose vast wealth had been accumulated through the ruthless European spice trade, and whose methods had earned him contemptuous whispers across the Atlantic, believed he had conceived the ultimate perfect punishment, a guaranteed brutal demise for a slave who had publicly shamed him. Before a group of esteemed guests, the scheme was simple, yet savagely effective. The man would be locked inside a heavily reinforced stockade alongside 6 of the property's most aggressive and dangerous bulls. These were not ordinary animals. These were beasts that had collectively gored 3 men to death in the preceding 2 years, and were known to attack anything that moved with unbridled ferocity. Vanir's explicit, cold-blooded decree was that the slave was to endure this confinement for a full 3 days, 72 hours, without any provision of food or water. If, against all odds, he were to survive, he would earn his freedom, but no one present, including the Baron himself, truly expected him to last even 3 hours. Yet, the outcome of this savage experiment became the most unsettling and enduring mystery in the county's history. When the pen was finally unlatched at the conclusion of the appointed 72 hours, the slave, named Tobias, emerged completely unharmed. More astonishing still, the 6 behemoth bulls followed him out, not with aggression, but with the quiet subservience of obedient dogs, refusing to leave his side. They had been utterly transformed from vicious killers into creatures described as docile, even protective. The strange phenomenon only deepened in the following weeks, as 14 additional bulls, originating from nearby properties, began to appear silently at the plantation gates, their demeanor calm and submissive, seeking only the proximity of this single man. In total, 20 massive bulls followed Tobias, all completely changed. The humiliated Baron, unable to reconcile the event with his world view, refused to ever speak of the incident again. 3 months later, Vanir was discovered dead in his study, the door locked from the inside, his face frozen in a terrifying mask of absolute horror. The same night, Tobias vanished. According to the sworn testimony of 7 witnesses, he took nothing with him save for the silent procession of 20 bulls that walked resolutely behind him into the deep shadows of the Georgia woods, initiating a legend that remains unexplained to this day. Baron Wilhelm Vanir's Georgia estate was a meticulous reflection of the American South in the 1840s, a place where authority derived solely from the ownership of land and labor, and where the plantation system dictated an unassailable social hierarchy. Vanir had acquired his massive estate near Valdosta in southern Georgia after arriving from the Netherlands, successfully converting the nearly 3,000 acres of prime agricultural land, bordered by pine forests and the Withlacoochee River, into one of the region's most profitable cotton plantations. His cruelty was not born of uncontrolled passion, but of calculated, systemic malice, designed to maximize control and efficiency. He rarely administered physical discipline himself, considering it beneath his dignity, but instead employed an overseer named Dalton, a man renowned for his cold efficiency and brutality. Vanir preferred psychological manipulation, orchestrating demeaning games where enslaved people competed for false promises of freedom or rewards, only to have the outcome arbitrarily snatched away, a deliberate act of fostering fear and perpetual uncertainty for his personal amusement. Above all, his obsession extended beyond cotton to massive, aggressive bulls, a fixation developed during his time in Spain, where he was mesmerized by their raw power and untamed aggression, viewing them as living symbols of the strength and dominance he cherished. He imported fighting breeds from Spain and Portugal, creating a herd so notorious it was fearfully referred to as the devil's herd by the workers. The three prior fatalities, Henry, crushed by the bull named Titan, Peter, whose arm was mangled by the black bull Goliath, leading to a fatal head injury, and Samuel, an experienced handler killed by a swift hoof strike, had necessitated the reinforcement of the bull pen with iron bars and decree that no worker should ever enter it again. The pen was an isolated, dangerous monument to Vanir's arbitrary power, serving no practical purpose beyond the display of absolute, untamed strength. Within the complex social strata of this 200-person plantation, where lives were governed entirely by Vanir's caprices, was Tobias, a man purchased 5 years prior in Savannah. Tobias was an enigma. The auction records listed him simply as a 30-year-old field hand with no known family. However, those who traveled with him from South Carolina spoke of him differently, noting his quiet intensity and the peculiar weight his few words carried. His gaze was unnerving, seeming to penetrate the facade people presented, reaching into something far deeper within them. Whispers circulated among the enslaved community. Some claimed he had been born in Africa and still held the knowledge of the old ways and languages. Others suggested he had been taught by someone who possessed that knowledge. A few even secretly wondered if he was entirely human, a being wearing a human shape. Everyone agreed on one thing: Tobias possessed a profoundly strange and powerful affinity with animals. Skittish horses calmed in his presence, dogs sat quietly near him, and workers had witnessed wild deer grazing unafraid near him in the fields, and birds landing on his shoulders as if he were merely an inanimate part of the landscape. His gift was quickly recognized by the stable master, Marcus, who secured Tobias's reassignment from the cotton fields to the care of the horses. For years, Tobias worked quietly, living in isolation in a small stable room, often disappearing into the woods on Sundays, while others attended the supervised religious services. Marcus, a cautious, free black man who had purchased his own freedom, once pressed Tobias about his unique ability, to which Tobias replied, "It's not a gift, it's understanding," clarifying that animals felt fear, pain, and the desire for safety, and if one truly understood that, the animals would know it. Vanir, too, had noted this skill, using Tobias to manage difficult livestock, but always with deep suspicion, as the power Tobias held was independent of the Baron's authority, a threat Vanir could not tolerate. This quiet, 5-year tension was the fuse that led to the incident which changed everything. The flashpoint occurred on a warm April evening in 1847, during an elaborate dinner hosted by Vanir for influential plantation owners and merchants, including Colonel James Hartley, Richard Brennan, and Thomas Fairfax, gatherings essential for establishing his social and political dominance. After the luxurious feast, and fueled by heavy drinking and a feeling of expansive confidence, Vanir committed his fatal error. He decided to parade his greatest, most terrifying possession before his guests, leading them outside to tour his magnificent and dangerous bulls. Standing by the formidable pen, Vanir proudly pointed out the killer animals, Titan and Goliath, detailing the deaths they had caused, emphasizing their nature as symbols of strength without mercy, dominance without question. As the Baron spoke, Goliath suddenly grew agitated, pawing the ground, snorting, and then violently slamming his massive body against the fence, a shock that caused the guests to instinctively recoil. Vanir, pleased by their terror, laughed, but when the other bulls joined in the furious bellowing and charging, even his own confidence wavered, forcing him to admit the animals were more agitated than usual. At that precise moment, Tobias arrived, drawn by the commotion from the nearby stable, carrying a bucket of feed. The moment Tobias stepped within 20 feet of the pen, the chaos ended instantly, as if a switch had been thrown. The 6 bulls froze, the bellowing stopped, and all of them turned to stare at Tobias with focused, non-aggressive attention, ignoring the men and the fence completely. Colonel Hartley, emboldened by brandy, broke the unsettling silence with a nervous, ill-advised joke. "Well, Baron, it seems your slave has more control over your bulls than you do." The words were meant to be light-hearted, but they struck Vanir as a public, intolerable humiliation. His authority had been questioned, his power diminished, and the insult had been delivered by the sheer, undeniable presence of a slave. Vanir's face darkened with a mixture of confusion and explosive rage, and the other guests fell into a terrified silence, immediately sensing the gravity of the mistake. He commanded Tobias forward, who walked slowly, his expression neutral, but his eyes betraying a flicker of grim recognition. He knew what punishment was coming. After questioning Tobias on his gift and receiving the simple, challenging reply that he merely understood them, Vanir's mocking smile returned. He announced his generous wager. Tobias would spend 3 days, 72 hours, inside the pen with the killer bulls, without food or water. If he survived the absurdly impossible task, he would receive his freedom and the substantial sum of $50. If he refused, he would be sold to a notoriously cruel plantation in Alabama. It was a transparent trap, offering certain death or delayed, brutal servitude. Yet after a silent moment with the bulls watching him calmly, Tobias accepted the wager. Vanir, momentarily stunned by the immediate acceptance, quickly recovered and ordered that the entire plantation be gathered at dawn to witness the educational spectacle. Word of the horrifying deal spread like wildfire that night, dividing the enslaved workers between those who feared for Tobias and those who held a strange, inexplicable hope. Marcus, the stable master, found Tobias, begging him to run, but Tobias replied with chilling composure, "Running would only make things worse for me and for everyone else here," revealing a certainty that this confrontation was inevitable, and that men like Vanir could not tolerate what they failed to comprehend. The next morning, a heavy, gray dawn greeted over 200 people assembled to watch the demonstration of Vanir's absolute power and the near-certain death of Tobias. Overseers stood armed near the reinforced fence. Margaret watched from the veranda with a pale face, and Vanir, dressed in his finest clothes, announced the terms of the 72-hour ordeal to the silent, captive audience before nodding to Dalton to unlock the chains of the gate. The morning air hung thick and heavy, saturated with the humid promise of a scorching April day and the metallic, pungent odor of the 6 great bulls within the reinforced enclosure. Over 200 people, the enslaved workforce, the overseers, and Vanir's distinguished dinner guests, formed a hushed, apprehensive arc around the monstrous pen, their collective presence creating a palpable, nervous energy. Baron Vanir stood at the forefront, his posture rigid and theatrical, savoring the morbid spectacle he had engineered. His expression was a volatile mix of cruel anticipation and a deep-seated need for vindication. He required this gruesome display to reassert his total authority, which Tobias's simple presence had inadvertently undermined the night before. When Vanir finally nodded to the overseer Dalton, the sound of the heavy iron gate being unlocked was a deafening, final pronouncement. Tobias, moving with a calmness that belied the absolute certainty of his impending doom, stepped deliberately into the arena. He wore only simple, patched cotton trousers and a thin shirt, offering no protection against the sheer, overwhelming mass of muscle and horn that now turned their unified attention towards him. The gate clanged shut behind him, the latch dropping like the fall of the executioner's axe, severing him completely from the world of human reason and law. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the 6 bulls remained motionless, their massive bodies fixed, their heads lowered, breathing heavily. They were disturbed less by the man himself than by the unusual crowd and the electric tension that radiated from the boundary. Then, as if a command had been issued from a place deeper than sound, the monstrous bull named Titan, a reddish-brown behemoth whose massive hump made him a figure of terrifying, prehistoric power, snorted once, scraped a hoof against the packed earth, and launched into a full, unstoppable charge. The crowd collectively gasped, a sound swiftly stifled by fear. This was the moment they had expected and dreaded, the inevitable, chaotic destruction. Titan, a creature whose instinct was pure, unadulterated aggression, covered the 40-foot distance in mere seconds, his horns lowered, aimed squarely at Tobias's center of mass. Tobias did not run, did not flinch, and did not raise his hands in a futile gesture of defense. He stood his ground, a fragile, stationary point against a wave of kinetic force. Yet, 10 feet from impact, with the thunder of the bull's approach shaking the very ground beneath the onlookers' feet, Titan's charge abruptly and impossibly broke. The massive animal skidded to a halt, scattering dust and gravel, its momentum dissipated not by a physical barrier, but by something unseen and incomprehensible. Titan did not veer away, nor did he circle back to attack. Instead, he stopped directly in front of Tobias, his colossal head hanging low, his nostrils flaring just inches from the man's chest. The silence that descended upon the plantation was absolute, broken only by the animal's heavy, labored breathing. Tobias remained utterly still, meeting the bull's fiery, dark eyes with his own, the exchange an intimate, silent conversation in a language without words. The narrative unfolding was not one of confrontation, but of communion. Tobias was not merely avoiding the bull, he was engaging with it on a plane inaccessible to the observers. He projected no fear, which was what the bull's predatory instincts sought, but neither did he project dominance, which would have triggered a territorial fight. Instead, he seemed to offer an unreserved and complete acknowledgement of the bull's existence, its power, its pain, and its raw animal nature. One by one, the other 5 bulls, including the notorious black bull Goliath, slowly advanced, forming a semicircle around the first 2. They did not appear aggressive, but rather cautious, driven by a deep, animalistic curiosity. For the next hour, this tableau held, the 5 enormous beasts circling slowly, observing, and Tobias, standing perfectly still, his eyes locked onto the bulls. The entire foundation of Baron Vanir's belief system, based on the absolute power of coercion and fear, began to crumble in that silent, sweltering hour. The animals were not acting like the vicious killers he had curated. They were behaving like hesitant, questioning entities. Vanir, livid and unable to tolerate the anticlimax, shouted at Dalton to throw something in, to provoke the beasts, but the overseer, now visibly pale, flatly refused, citing the danger to his own life and the sheer unpredictability of the massive creatures. It was Tobias who made the next decisive move. With the sun now climbing toward its apex, he lowered his gaze, moved slowly toward the heavy wooden post supporting the watering trough, dry per Vanir's orders, and then, in a gesture of profound and utter surrender, he sat down, resting his back against the rough wood. He was now not just exposed, but completely vulnerable, his vitals open to any sudden strike, a position that should have been an immediate death sentence. Yet the bulls did not move. They watched, their massive bodies radiating a tension that slowly, inexplicably, began to dissipate. After an excruciating period of observation, Titan let out a long, sighing exhalation that was more mournful than aggressive, and then, with a sound like a great canvas collapsing, he lay down in the dust, his head resting heavily on the ground. Goliath followed suit, and then the others, until all 6 behemoths were lying down, forming a protective, though terrifying, cordon around the seated man. The sight was so unnervingly unnatural that the assembly of onlookers was paralyzed. The initial fear gave way to a profound, unsettling confusion. They had come to witness a gruesome tragedy. They were instead witnessing a miracle of inexplicable peace. As the long hours of the day dragged on, the men who had been ordered to guard the pen watched in a bewildered stupor. Tobias did nothing but breathe, occasionally shifting to find a sliver of shade. He attempted to lick the condensation from the cool iron bars, his throat already parched in the relentless heat, but his movements were unhurried, almost meditative. The bulls, meanwhile, seemed to be settling into a rhythm of rest, occasionally shuffling or flicking flies with their tails, but never once moving in a way that suggested aggression toward the man in their center. When the sun finally began its descent, bathing the pen in the long orange shadows of the first evening, Tobias was still there, alive, unharmed, and now nestled within the unintentional protection of the 6 most dangerous animals on the plantation. The bulls had done the unthinkable. They had become his quiet, hulking guardians, completing the first full day of the impossible wager, and shattering forever the logical order of Baron Vanir's cruel world. The overseers and guests left, not with the satisfaction of a master's power affirmed, but with the terrifying, gut-churning realization that they had just witnessed an event that defied every single rule they thought governed reality, leaving them with an indelible image of a man and 6 killers, united in an unholy, inexplicable peace. The passing of the first night brought no relief, only a deepening sense of dread and an atmosphere of uncanny quiet over the plantation. Baron Vanir, driven by an obsessive need to understand, and more importantly, to undo the public humiliation, returned to the bullpen before dawn on the second day, bringing with him Colonel Hartley and Richard Brennan, 2 of his most trusted, albeit increasingly bewildered, guests. They found the scene exactly as they had left it, Tobias seated against the post, his face now gaunt from thirst and the long night, and the 6 massive bulls still lying peacefully around him, their collective presence creating a warm, dusty perimeter. The sight was a profound violation of natural order, a blasphemy against Vanir's belief in absolute brutal control. He paced outside the reinforced bars, his face a mask of impotent rage, alternately barking orders at the animals to move and muttering threats at Tobias. The bulls simply lifted their great heads, watched the Baron with unnervingly calm eyes, and then settled back down, utterly indifferent to his authority. This silent defiance from his own beasts was perhaps a greater agony to him than any direct challenge from a man. The second day was marked by a relentless, oppressive heat that quickly began to test the limits of human endurance, both for Tobias and for the workers forced to observe. Tobias's physical condition began its inevitable decline. Thirst was now a constant, grinding agony. His lips were cracked, and his movements were becoming slower and more deliberate, the signs of a body under extreme duress. Yet his mental state seemed only to sharpen. He did not waste energy. He remained predominantly still, conserving his meager resources. The unique interaction he maintained with the bulls became clearer, evolving from a simple cessation of hostility to something deeper, resembling an exchange of trust. When a fly landed repeatedly on his cheek, he did not use his hands. Instead, he made a small, soft, almost inaudible sound, a guttural hum that resonated deep in his chest, and the nearest bull, Goliath, instantly stirred, lowered his head, and gently nudged the fly away with a twitch of his massive ear. It was a gesture of deliberate, sentient service that chilled the handful of witnesses who saw it, including the foreman, Dalton, who stood rigidly outside the pen, gripping his rifle like a religious relic. Later that afternoon, a sudden storm rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised, ominous purple, accompanied by a deafening clap of thunder. The change in atmosphere immediately affected the animals. Bulls, generally prone to panic during electrical storms, began to twitch and shuffle nervously, their huge bodies shifting, a deep, unsettling rumbling noise emanating from their throats. This was the moment of maximum danger. The slightest movement from Tobias could have been misread in the chaos, triggering a stampede or a defensive attack. But again, Tobias intervened not with force, but with a unique form of communication. He did not shout, nor did he frantically try to soothe them. Instead, he slowly and deliberately began to rock gently, his whole body acting as a silent metronome. He looked directly at Titan, whose eyes were rolling in panic, and the slow, rhythmic rocking seemed to transmit a pulse of absolute stability, an unshakable presence that contradicted the violence of the storm. As the rain began to lash down in massive, tropical sheets, turning the dust to mud, Tobias reached out a shaky hand. He placed his palm flat against the massive, rain-slicked flank of Goliath, maintaining a light, steady pressure. He began to whisper, the words inaudible to the overseers outside the pen, but clearly directed toward the animal. The immediate effect was astonishing. Goliath, who had been on the verge of rising, instantly calmed, lowering his head, seeming to absorb the quiet rhythm of the man's touch and breath. The other bulls followed this lead, settling their bulk in the mud, remaining still while the storm raged around them, their focus anchored entirely on the motionless man at their center. The sight of these 6,000-pound killers, huddled submissively under the torrential rain and thunder around a frail, starving human, was a powerful, symbolic image of a world turned upside down. Baron Vanir watched this defiance from the dry sanctuary of his veranda, a glass of brandy shaking precariously in his hand. The initial desire for revenge had curdled into a corrosive fear. He could not comprehend how the rules of nature that had defined his existence could be so easily and thoroughly broken by a man he considered nothing more than property. He began searching for rational explanations, desperately clinging to the idea of a trick. Perhaps Tobias had used a rare animal musk or a sophisticated, unnoticed drug. He interrogated Dalton and the other overseers, demanding they inspect the pen for concealed items, but the men insisted they had watched Tobias enter empty-handed and had meticulously guarded the perimeter. The truth that the power lay entirely within Tobias himself was too unbearable for Vanir's rigid, egocentric mind to accept. The fear, however, was not only for his reputation, it was a primal, deeper fear. Tobias had demonstrated a power that was outside the Baron's control, a spiritual or psychological dominance that transcended the physical boundaries of the pen and the laws of the plantation. By the end of the second day, a subtle, profound shift had occurred not just with the bulls, but with the enslaved community. Initially, their observation had been characterized by a mixture of fear and passive resistance. Now, a quiet, almost sacred hope had taken root. They saw Tobias's survival not as a mere anomaly, but as a sign, a symbol that the oppressive, unyielding power of the Baron and his world was not, in fact, absolute. If a man could survive Vanir's perfect punishment and command the most terrifying creatures on the property, then perhaps their own suffering was not permanent, and their servitude was not an eternal state. The silent vigil continued into the second night. Tobias was now severely dehydrated and dangerously weak, but he was alive. The 6 bulls, having weathered the storm, now rested in a tight, watchful circle around him, creating an impermeable fortress of horn and muscle that no earthly power, including the Baron's, dared to breach. As the final day of the 72-hour ordeal dawned with a perverse sense of tranquility that was more unsettling than any chaos. The sky was clear, the heat promised to be relentless, and the scene within the pen remained impossibly static. Tobias, now a figure of profound physical distress, was still sheltered by the circle of immense, quiescent bulls. He had survived 54 hours without sustenance, his body operating on sheer will and the strange, inexplicable energy that seemed to flow between him and the animals. His skin was tight and pallid, his eyes sunken, yet they still held that unnerving, crystalline focus. The overseer Dalton, who was assigned the watch, reported a sense of deep, personal discomfort. The pen no longer felt like a place of human dominance, but a sanctuary controlled by rules he could not comprehend. He noted in his ledger that the bulls, specifically Titan and Goliath, had begun to exhibit a behavior resembling vigilance. If a stray dog or a small snake approached the fence, the bulls would rise slowly, facing the intruder with a silent, threatening immensity until the threat retreated. Then they would settle back down. They were actively defending the man. Baron Vanir, unable to tear himself away from the spectacle that was destroying his reputation and sanity, ordered a small table and a chair to be placed 20 yards from the pen, positioning himself like an adjudicator at a horrifying sporting event. He brought with him a pocket watch, ticking away the minutes toward the 72-hour deadline. His intent now shifted from witnessing a death to forcing Tobias to concede and admit to a trick. He viewed Tobias's survival not as a miracle, but as an insult, a successful challenge to his absolute authority. Vanir offered increasing sums of money, $200, then $300, for Tobias to simply stand up, walk to the gate, and admit he was starving, offering a pre-written confession that the animals had been docile all along. Tobias did not even turn his head, his focus entirely inward, conserving every precious ounce of energy, his silence a profound and powerful rejection of the Baron's pathetic attempts at control. As the morning wore on, a profound moment of connection occurred that was witnessed by 3 of the nearest guards. Tobias, in a movement so slow it seemed deliberate, reached out to the ground and weakly picked up a small, smooth river stone, no larger than his thumb. He held it between his fingers, then gently pressed it against his forehead, a gesture that could have been a sign of intense pain or a silent ritual. Titan, the great bull who had initiated the first charge, instantly rose, moving with surprising delicacy for an animal of his size. He approached Tobias, lowered his massive head, and began to lick the side of the man's face. It was not a rough, abrasive lick, but a gentle, almost therapeutic action, a brief but intense moment of grooming, an act typically reserved for a mother comforting her calf. The animal seemed to be applying a mixture of saliva and moisture to Tobias's parched skin and cracked lips, a desperate, intuitive attempt to alleviate the man's severe dehydration. Tobias allowed the action for a few moments, then raised his hand to pat the bull's massive nose, a gesture of thanks and acceptance before leaning back, having received the strange, life-giving communion. This act of tenderness from a creature known only for its murderous rage was the final, unassailable piece of evidence for the witnesses. This was not a trick of musk or drug. It was a complete, radical reversal of the natural hierarchy, driven by a bond they could only categorize as spiritual. Word spread rapidly among the gathered workforce. The beasts are serving him. The power has changed hands. The atmosphere surrounding the pen became charged with anticipation and suppressed excitement, the enslaved people exchanging quiet, hopeful glances. They realized that Vanir's game had backfired spectacularly. The moment the clock hit 72 hours, Tobias would not only walk free, but his freedom would be a revolutionary act, sealed by the undeniable testimony of the animals themselves. Vanir, realizing the spectacle was now irretrievably lost, retreated to his study, instructing Dalton to open the gate precisely at the mark, but to keep the workers back. He sat alone in his darkened office, listening to the ticking of his clock, the sound now a countdown not to a slave's death, but to his own public execution. The clock struck the final hour of the 3rd day. The final moments of the 72-hour confinement were saturated with a tension so thick it was almost physical, a palpable entity pressing down on the witnesses gathered around the enclosure. Inside the pen, Tobias was a study in stillness. a fragile figure of bone and sinew, clinging to consciousness, his spirit seemingly the only thing sustaining his body. His thirst had reached a critical, agonizing level, his tongue swollen and his senses dulled, yet he maintained his posture, resting against the dry post, surrounded by the silent, colossal forms of the 6 bulls. The bulls, for their part, seemed to anticipate the impending conclusion. They were restless, a deep, continuous rumble emanating from their chests, not of aggression, but of profound, protective readiness. They shifted their weight, their heads alertly tracking the movements of the overseer Dalton and the small cluster of men guarding the gate. The air was charged with the understanding that this was not merely a moment of release, but a transition of power. Precisely as the grandfather clock in Vanir's distant study chimed the final, resonant stroke, marking the end of the 3rd day, Dalton approached the gate, his rifle held loosely. His expression unreadable, a mix of bewilderment and fear. Following the Baron's explicit, if confused, orders, he struggled with the heavy iron chain and latch, the metallic scrape of the lock echoing sharply across the expectant silence. As the gate swung inward, revealing the path to freedom, the 6 bulls immediately rose to their feet with a unified, deliberate motion, their bodies massive and imposing. They did not move toward the gate, but positioned themselves defensively around Tobias, effectively forming a living, armored wall between him and the outside world. This was the moment of truth, the final testament to the unnatural bond. Tobias slowly, painstakingly, pushed himself away from the post, his movements betraying the severe toll the dehydration and exposure had taken. He did not look at the gate, nor did he look at the overseer. Instead, he raised his head and locked eyes with Titan, the dominant bull, and then with Goliath, offering them a silent, profound acknowledgement. In that moment, he seemed to be communicating something vital, a final, wordless exchange of intent. Only after this silent ritual did he turn, and, moving with the measured, ritualistic pace of a man emerging from a sacred trial, he walked toward the open gate. The crowd, the enslaved workers and the few remaining guards, held their collective breath, waiting for a final, catastrophic betrayal. But no betrayal came. As Tobias stepped across the threshold, a free man, the 6 bulls followed him in perfect, unnatural order. They did not jostle, nor did they show any sign of their former rage. They simply walked, massive and silent, their demeanor utterly transformed, their eyes fixed on the man in front of them. The sheer, overwhelming size and quiet power of the procession froze the guards in their tracks. No one dared move or raise a weapon against the man who was now implicitly protected by 6,000 pounds of sentient, controlled aggression. Tobias did not speak a single word to the onlookers, nor did he make a gesture. He simply walked past the shocked and bewildered Dalton, heading directly towards the wooded path that led away from the plantation grounds and into the untamed Georgia landscape. The immediate reaction among the enslaved community was not one of celebration, but of profound, sacred awe. They had witnessed a visible miracle, a clear demonstration that the forces of nature, and perhaps even the forces of the divine, did not necessarily align with the white man's claim to absolute power. A deep, silent ripple of hope spread through the field hands, a realization that the Baron's world had been fundamentally destabilized. Vanir's perfect punishment had become the perfect liberation, a public, undeniable failure that had consecrated Tobias as something more than just a man. The physical reality of the situation was no less astonishing. The 6 bulls, Titan, Goliath, and the others, refused to remain on the property. They followed Tobias as closely as trained dogs, stopping only when he stopped, and waiting patiently when he paused to recover from the ordeal. This unprecedented behavior was immediately reported to Vanir, who, hearing the news in his darkened study, experienced a psychological breakdown that completed the process of his humiliation. He had been defeated not by insurrection, but by the mysterious, incomprehensible will of a man he had sought to destroy. The sight of his prized, aggressive bulls, the very symbols of his ruthless dominance, now serving as the quiet entourage of a newly freed, starving man, was the ultimate, unbearable irony. Over the next 2 weeks, the anomaly only intensified. Reports began trickling in from surrounding plantations, the Vance Plantation, the Hartley Estate, the Fairfax Farm. More bulls, notorious, aggressive breeding stock, were disappearing from their pens and pastures. These were animals of immense value and fierce temperaments, yet they were found arriving one by one at the Vanir plantation's main gate, their demeanor calm and submissive. By the end of the second week, Tobias's retinue numbered 20 bulls, all exhibiting the same unnerving tranquility and dedication to the man they had sought out. They would stand quietly outside the small, dilapidated shed where Tobias was temporarily sheltering, waiting patiently for his emergence. This silent, growing army of transformed beasts was a powerful, undeniable symbol of a profound shift, the visual evidence of a mystery that neither the white society nor the enslaved workers could rationally explain, yet all were compelled to witness. The psychological aftermath of Tobias's emergence and the unprecedented transformation of the bulls was arguably more devastating than any physical damage the beasts could have inflicted. Baron Vanir, confined within the luxurious solitude of his study, found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making, his calculated cruelty having yielded a profound existential defeat. The 20 massive bulls, now a silent, unwavering entourage, had become a living, breathing monument to his failure, a mockery of his deeply held belief in brute force and the absolute subservience of nature to the will of man. Vanir, who had always prized a cold, rational control, was now confronted with an anomaly that defied all rational thought, a phenomenon that could only be explained through the very superstitions he had always scorned, a kind of powerful, inexplicable magic or a divine intervention that seemed to favor the weak and the oppressed over the powerful. The sight of the bulls, symbols of his proprietary strength, refusing to acknowledge him and instead dedicating their immense power to the protection of a freedman, drove him to a state of near paranoia. He began to see Tobias everywhere, not physically, but as a corrosive force permeating his domain. He could not look out his window without imagining the shadow of the great bulls. He couldn't eat without feeling the specter of Tobias's starvation. His meticulous control over the plantation dissolved as the enslaved community, emboldened by the miracle, adopted a posture of quiet, unified resistance. Though there were no overt acts of rebellion, the work slowed, the obedience became a mere formality, and the fear that Vanir relied upon evaporated, replaced by the collective memory of the man who walked out of the bullpen unharmed. Vanir's authority had not been challenged by a revolt of men, but by a revolt of the natural world, a far more terrifying prospect. In his desperate search for a logical explanation, Vanir became obsessed with 2 possibilities: poison or a secret form of animal control brought over from Africa. He sent trusted, armed men to shadow Tobias, but they always returned with the same bewildered reports. Tobias did nothing but rest, occasionally walk, and the bulls simply followed. They never saw him feed them or speak to them. The animals remained devotedly near him, refusing to let any of Vanir's men approach closer than 30 feet. The search for a rational culprit turned inward, consuming Vanir. He began to distrust his own food and drink, fearing a slow poison. His sleep was plagued by nightmares where the 20 bulls, led by a silent Tobias, stomped through the floorboards of his mansion. He dismissed his cooks, his servants, and finally, even the loyal Dalton, isolating himself completely in his study, a man reduced to a quivering prisoner within the walls of his own mansion. Meanwhile, Tobias, having fully recovered from the physical ordeal in the following weeks, now occupied a liminal space on the edge of the property, technically a free man, but an inescapable presence. He had acquired a small sack of provisions from the now sympathetic stable master, Marcus. but he made no move to truly leave. He understood that his freedom, bought at such an extraordinary price, carried a greater responsibility than simple escape. He had become a symbol, and his continued presence was a silent, powerful destabilization of the Baron's tyranny. He spent his time in the deep pine woods bordering the estate, often simply sitting, watching the sun filter through the trees, while his extraordinary escort of 20 bulls grazed and rested nearby. This silent, nonviolent occupation was the final, devastating blow to Vanir's sanity. The end came 3 months after the initial incident. On a humid afternoon, Vanir was discovered by a house servant who, after 2 days of receiving no answer, was finally forced to break down the study door. Vanir was dead, seated rigidly at his desk, his hand still clutching a quill, a half-written letter to his Dutch solicitor lying before him. The door was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of struggle, intrusion, or physical assault. Yet his face was fixed in an appalling rictus of absolute, unadulterated terror, an expression that suggested he had died not from natural causes, but from an overwhelming, sudden shock of fear. The doctor who attended the scene, a man named Dr. Elias Thorne, could only record the official cause of death as apoplexy stroke due to acute mental distress, unable to explain the raw, visceral horror etched onto the Baron's features. The unfinished letter on the desk spoke volumes, detailing Vanir's intention to sell the plantation immediately, citing unforeseen and unbearable psychological pressures, and requesting the solicitor to handle the sale from a distance. The ultimate, and perhaps most disturbing, postscript to the event occurred the same night of Vanir's death. Under the cover of heavy darkness, 7 enslaved witnesses reported seeing Tobias finally leave. He walked into the deep woods bordering the river, and following him was the entire formidable procession, 20 bulls, moving with the quiet, unified purpose of a well-drilled legion, disappearing into the shadows. They took nothing, left no trail, and were never seen in the county again. The narrative that solidified in the years following the event suggested that Tobias had fulfilled his function. He had earned his freedom and perhaps served as the instrument of a necessary metaphysical justice. The immediate disappearance of Tobias and his escort of 20 bulls following Baron Vanir's death cemented the incident in the local psyche, lifting it out of the realm of mere historical oddity and placing it firmly into the territory of unsettling legend. The event was no longer just a strange thing that happened. It was a preternatural reckoning that had physically manifested on the Vanir plantation. The plantation itself, once a vibrant symbol of wealth and brutal efficiency, became a poisoned, unwanted relic. With the Baron dead and the enslaved population deeply unsettled, the land's value plummeted. Colonel Hartley and Richard Brennan, the initial prospective buyers, quickly withdrew their interest, citing the unwholesome air of the place. The final horrifying image of Vanir's terror-stricken face and the inexplicable departure of the bull herd were indelible stains on the property's reputation. The estate eventually fell into the hands of Vanir's distant, unwilling Dutch relatives, who, fearful of the long sea journey and the strange American stories, sold it off piecemeal and at a significant loss to a series of absentee owners. The cotton fields slowly surrendered to neglect, and the grand house began its long, lonely decay. Crucially, the narrative of Tobias took on a life of its own, evolving rapidly within the oral traditions of the former enslaved communities. In these stories, Tobias was elevated from a simple field hand to a figure of spiritual power and righteous justice. He was no longer just a man who survived, but an instrument of a forgotten, older knowledge, a person who could communicate directly with the earth and its wild inhabitant, say conjurer or a mighty man, who was able to turn the master's own weapons against him. These tales served a vital psychological function. They provided a powerful counter, narrative to the brutal ideology of the plantation system. If the laws of man's slavery, property, ownership could be overturned by the laws of nature, as demonstrated by the bull's transformation, then the entire structure of the oppression was fragile and ultimately impermanent. The story became a source of quiet, enduring hope and covert resistance, a whisper passed down through generations that not all power belonged to the overseer and the whip. The 6 initial bulls, Titan and Goliath, were transformed in the telling into mythical beasts, guardians of the boundary, who had recognized the true essence of the man and offered him their fidelity, serving as his silent, massive bodyguards against the forces of human evil. The fate of Tobias and his 20 bulls, once they vanished into the vast, dense woods of southern Georgia, became a second layer of the mystery. The most persistent and evocative legend claims they traveled south, seeking the unsettled, untamed swampland of Florida, a place where the laws of man had little purchase and where the terrain itself acted as a natural sanctuary. It was believed that Tobias went there to live a life completely removed from human society, a man who had chosen the companionship of beasts over the cruelty of his own species. Sporadic, unreliable reports surfaced in the decades that followed. A brief sighting near the Okefenokee Swamp in 1008, 155 of a man accompanied by an impossibly large herd of docile European breed bulls, or a rumor of a settlement in the Everglades where the cattle were handled by silent touch rather than by ropes and whips. None of these stories were ever verified, and their truth mattered less than their existence. They solidified Tobias's status as a folk hero of resistance, a man who had not just escaped slavery, but had literally walked away from the very concept of human society, escorted by the very creatures designed to destroy him. Ultimately, the story of Tobias became a metaphor for the enduring question of rationality versus the inexplicable. Historians and folklorists who have studied the Vanir case have offered various, flawed explanations. Perhaps the bulls, having been confined and brutalized, responded to Tobias's total lack of fear, sensing in his stillness a unique form of dominance. Perhaps the near-death state induced by starvation altered his pheromones, making him seem non-threatening, or perhaps, as Vanir himself desperately feared, there was a specialized, forgotten technique for calming aggressive animals. However, no purely scientific explanation has ever accounted for the subsequent arrival of the 14 outside bulls, nor for the immediate and profound transformation of their nature from killers to dedicated protectors. The legend remains an open wound in the history of the Deep South, a documented anomaly that forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable idea that some events, once witnessed, simply refuse to be domesticated by logic. The definitive end of the Tobias narrative, marked by his final, silent departure into the woods with his massive, devoted escort, serves less as a conclusion and more as a powerful, unsettling punctuation mark on the history of the Vanir plantation. The story refuses the comfort of a neat resolution. It deliberately denies posterity the satisfaction of a full explanation, ensuring its survival as a true, baffling historical anomaly. The last confirmed sighting, a line of 20 colossal shapes melting into the Georgia darkness, following a single, frail human figure, is the story's enduring image, a powerful visual metaphor for the triumph of an unknown, deeper power over the tyranny of human logic and cruelty. This final act was not a panicked flight, but a purposeful, processional exodus, an irreversible separation from a world of brutal, arbitrary rules. For all the historical documentation, the sworn affidavits of the guards, the death certificate of Baron Vanir, and the undeniable account of the 20 missing, highly aggressive bulls, the event remains fundamentally inexplicable. Scholars may argue over the presence of pheromones, the effects of starvation on human scent, or a sophisticated application of forgotten African knowledge, but none of these theories adequately addresses the scope of the phenomenon, the initial transformation, the 3 days of absolute peace within the pen, the tender licking of the man's face, the sudden, collective arrival of 14 outside bulls, and the immediate, terrifying death of the man who sought to control them. The story compels us to acknowledge that for all our certainty, for all the progress of science and the rational explanations that underpin our modern world, there are still deep, persistent cracks in the foundation of our understanding. The tragedy of Baron Vanir, discovered dead in his locked study with a face contorted by ultimate horror, is the story's counterpoint to Tobias's quiet triumph. Vanir's death was a form of poetic, metaphysical justice. He was not killed by the bulls, the weapons of his own tyranny, but by the complete destruction of his world view. The horror etched on his face was not the terror of an assailant, but the terror of confrontation with a truth he could not bear, that there was a power greater than his money, his whips, or his fear. He was undone by the simple, peaceful reality of a man surviving the impossible, and in his final moments, he likely realized that the true, terrifying force was not the ferocity of the animals, but the inexplicable, unassailable peace that Tobias possessed. The silence that fell over the plantation after Tobias left was profound and lasting. The fields grew fallow, the mansion decayed, and the memory of the Baron faded, replaced by the persistent whispers of the man and the bulls. The tale of Tobias, the slave who was guarded by the very beasts meant to gore him, is a legacy that remains perpetually open. It is a mystery without a solution, a question perpetually posed to history, a chilling reminder of the limits of human knowledge. Perhaps, as is often the case with the most profound legends, this story is not meant to be solved at all. Perhaps it is meant to exist as a permanent, unsettling reminder that there are forces older, deeper, and more mysterious than the fleeting constructs of human power, forces that can slip through the rational world and restore a balance that had been unjustly broken. And so, the legend of Tobias and his escort of 20 silent, transformed bulls walks on, disappearing forever into the depths of the untamed American landscape, carrying with it a secret that no historian, no scientist, and no master can ever truly grasp.